Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for Priya FieldingSingh's book talk, How the Other Half Eats, the Untold Story of Food and Inequality in America, which is hot off the press or hot off the container ship, I understand. It's wonderful to see you all here today. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Allison Crossley. I'm the Executive Director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research. And since 1974, the Clayman Institute has conducted intersectional gender research, has convened interdisciplinary communities of gender researchers, and has endeavored to translate gender research to broad audiences. We host many events pertaining to gender and intersectionality that are open to all. And a special thank you to our co-sponsors of today's event, the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and the Center on Poverty and Inequality. Our book talk today is the first of 4 book talks this academic year. The next one is on January 26th at 4 p.m. on our director Adrienne Daub's new book, The Dynastic Imagination, Family and Modernity in 19th Century Germany. And we're also having book talks in 2022 with Aliyah Hamid Rao on her book, Crunch Time, How Married Couples Confront Unemployment, and Susan Krieger on her book, Are You Two Sisters? The Journey of a Lesbian Couple. Please see our website for more information, and you can also sign up there for our newsletter, which will keep you up to date on all of our research and events. Before I introduce our speaker, a few programming notes. Priya will speak for 20 to 25 minutes, and I'll offer a few thoughts in conclusion and then a question. And we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience after that. For questions, you can either use the chat function to type out your question, which I will then read, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and I will call on you and you can ask your question yourself. This event is being recorded and live captioned. Now to introduce our speaker. Priya FieldingSingh is a sociologist and assistant professor in the Department of Family and Consumer Studies at the University of Utah. She completed her PhD in sociology from Stanford and did postdoctoral training as an NIH fellow in cardiovascular disease prevention at the Stanford School of Medicine. Her work is at the intersection of sociology and medicine, and she is an expert on gender, family, and health disparities in the contemporary US. In addition to her book that she will speak about today, which received a starred review from Publishers Weekly, Priya has published broadly in both scholarly and popular outlets. She has won a number of awards for her academic work and also recently wrote an opinion piece on CNN about race and escalating food costs. During her time as a PhD student, Priya was a research assistant and graduate dissertation fellow at the Clayman Institute. And it was our pleasure to get to know Priya and her research, and she contributed so much to our feminist community while she was at Stanford. So thank you so much to all of you for being here today, and thank you for Priya for being here today as well. I will now turn it over to you, Priya.
Great. Can everyone see that? Thumbs up. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that really kind introduction, Allison, and thank you so much to you and the Clayman Institute for inviting me here today, and to the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society and the Center on Poverty and Inequality for co-sponsoring this event. These are all centers on campus that had a really profound impact on me and this research during my time at Stanford. And so it's really just an honor to be back with their support and to have the opportunity to share with you all the work that really came out of my time here. So today I'm going to talk about a stream of research that features in my book, How the Other Half Eats. And in this research, I draw on years of fieldwork that I conducted in the San Francisco Bay Area on families' diets to show how the emotions that mothers across the income spectrum feel about feeding their kids really fundamentally shapes what goes onto their children's plates. And this is a line of research that I'm also excited about. I'm extending it further with my colleague and fellow Stanford sociologist, Marianne Cooper. Now, before I start, you may be asking yourself, what do moms' emotions have to do with kids' diets? And that's a really reasonable question because scholarship on families' diets and dietary inequalities rarely, if ever, discuss emotions or how parents or kids feel about the food that they eat. But through my research on the ground with families, I learned that emotions are actually really central to how mothers, the parent in the US, still primarily responsible for food within families, how mothers feed their children. And my goal today is to show you why that is. So I'm going to start by telling you really briefly about two mothers that I interviewed. The first mom was a low-income mother named Brenda, who had emigrated about 17 years earlier to the San Francisco Bay Area from Colombia and had worked since then as a cashier and a hardware floor sales rep. Since arriving on American soil, Brenda had also experienced family deportation, unemployment, repeated evictions, as well as food insecurity. Indeed, a consistent theme of Brenda's experience feeding her children was that at times there was simply not enough money to ensure that she, her husband, and her kids had enough of the food that they wanted to eat. And this was a hard fact for Brenda to come to terms with, and the guilt of struggling to provide really weighed on her. But experienced as Brenda was with this reality, she was also very adept at making food go further for her family. And she was equally, if not more skilled, at reframing the hardship of hunger as opportunity. Brenda told me that one thing she learned over the years was that the food tasted better when you divided it up, when you rationed it between people. Remembering this helped her see a glass half full when the cupboards emptied out. And she instilled this positive lesson in her kids too. She told me, since they were kids, I teach them to share one item for everybody. Then they appreciate how good is that item. Not one person, two-person is better. It really tastes better. 5 weeks later, I sat down with Amber Dawson, a high-income white mother who since earning her MBA at Stanford, had been a full-time caregiver to her two daughters while her husband worked as a venture capitalist. While Amber was unfamiliar with experiences of food insecurity and struggling to provide enough food, that didn't mean that she didn't feel guilty too. The day that Amber and I met, she told me that she felt like a failure. Her daughter Leanne had become addicted to Frappuccinos, and what was worse, Amber had recently been giving in to her daughter's request for those just to keep the peace. Pausing to reflect for a moment, Amber explained, "We're probably on the not great end of the spectrum. I know kids who eat a lot better than my kids do." Amber felt like such a terrible mom when it came to feeding her daughters, to the point where at the end of our conversation, she requested that I please change her name before I publish anything from the research. A few months into my field research, I began to grapple with a contradiction. I walked away from interviews with lower income moms like Brenda, knowing that they were parenting under exceptionally challenging circumstances that made feeding kids difficult. At the same time, these moms didn't always seem or act so worried about how their kids were eating. Even though they discussed wanting their kids to eat nutritiously and they voiced frustration about how that didn't always happen, they also seemed somewhat surprisingly okay with the situation. In contrast, I emerged from interviews with more affluent mothers like Amber feeling the exact opposite. These mothers were often so stressed and troubled by their children's diets that even though I knew their families had ample resources for food, I felt like they were struggling in some ways even more than low-income moms. But over time, my analysis of these conversations and interactions with mothers showed me that these very different narratives and feelings around feeding kids illustrated mothers' very different approaches to dealing with maternal guilt related to that feeding. In feeding kids, Brenda, Amber, and other mothers I met were beholden to particular cultural standards for motherhood, standards that have escalated over the past 30 years and that sociologists refer to as the ideology of intensive mothering. The intensive mothering ideology specifies that moms must be their kids' primary caregivers, and good moms utilize child-centered, expert-guided, emotionally absorbing, labor-intensive, and financially expensive child-rearing methods. In the US, the intensive mothering ideology is widely diffused across society, with the cultural consensus being that it is the ideal mothering approach. However, because of the incredible difficulty for any mom of living up to these cultural ideas of what makes a good mother set by intensive mothering, most moms in the US report feeling a strong sense of guilt. Maternal guilt involves mothers' sense that they can never do enough for their children. And in the United States, scholars argue that it's the cultural ascendance of unrealistic mothering expectations combined with the complete lack of structural supports for caregiving that leaves mothers feeling as though they are constantly falling short, which leads to the very consistent research finding that today guilt is really a cornerstone of contemporary motherhood. But for me, as someone interested in health and diet, I was interested in the question of how do mothers' feelings or experiences of guilt shape how they feed their children? And that may seem like a strange question, but I ask it because of just how core, how germane really feeding kids is to the project of intensive mothering and to these really overarching cultural ideals and understandings about what it means to be a good mom in this country. The work that mothers do to feed children, or what sociologists fancily call maternal food work, is a highly gendered, laborious, and increasingly high stakes task. It's a task that in 4 out of 5 married heterosexual couples with children, mothers are in charge of, and it's a task for which there are virtually no institutional or structural supports to manage its demands. So for me to understand how mothers' feelings of guilt related to their kids and their families' diets, I leveraged data from a broader qualitative study of families, for which I conducted 160 interviews with parents and kids over the course of 3 years in the San Francisco Bay Area about how their families ate. And today, I'm going to focus on the data from interviews that I conducted with 74 mothers across income levels. And in these interviews, I spoke to mothers about how they fed their kids, as well as their expectations of, challenges with, and conflicts around feeding. And my goal was not just to understand what and how mothers fed their kids, but also how mothers felt and thought and made sense of their children's diets. I also conducted participant observations of 4 moms and their families, and I spent time with them as they went about their days, talking about planning for, preparing, and eating food. I was really embedded in their everyday interactions. I attended birthday parties, I chopped fruit at kitchen counters, I sat in the drive-through, and I stood outside food banks with them. And through all of this data collection, what I learned was that across income levels, moms shared in the broadest strokes some pretty similar ideas about how they as mothers should be feeding their children. So there was, of course, really important variation across social class and race ethnicity and mothers' exact expectations of themselves. But across my sample, 2 kind of straightforward expectations about maternal food work and kids' diets really stood out. So first, most moms believed that their kids should be eating a healthy diet, and they shared broadly similar ideas about what that meant. You know, things like vegetables and fruits and whole grains were largely agreed upon as healthy choices for children, whereas unhealthy foods generally included things like soda, candy, chips, and fast food. And second, most moms agreed that good moms were aware of and invested in what kids ate. Moms believed that mothers were the ones who should be, or at the very least were, responsible for ensuring that kids consumed a healthy diet. Yet most moms I met also felt like they were failing to live up to these standards. The resulting gap between moms' expectations and their perceptions of their actual performance generated feelings of guilt. Indeed, 63 out of 74 mothers expressed feeling guilty in interviews. While most moms cared about their kids' diets, they also felt that their kids didn't always eat a healthy diet and that kids' dietary flaws were because they, as moms, didn't do the best job. For instance, Catalina, a Latina mom, told me that her full-time job sometimes demanded that she stay late at the office in the evenings. And so she went through periods where she would order her children dinner from a nearby taqueria. She told me, I'm like, this is horrible. I'm pumping my family and myself full of junk. Similarly, Penelope, a white mother, explained that she cooked dinner for her family Monday through Thursday, but ran out of energy by Friday when she ended up buying frozen Indian meals for everyone. She said, it feels awful to do it, but I just can't keep up. While mothers across the sample expressed feelings of guilt like Penelope and Catalina, I also found that mothers' strategies for navigating that guilt really varied. Specifically, what varied was how mothers engaged in what is known as emotion work to navigate or manage that guilt. When faced with an emotional dilemma, one key way that a person can seek to assuage or eliminate that dilemma is by doing what the sociologist Arlie Hochschild calls working on feeling, or engaging in emotion work. Emotion work is the internal work that each of us do to monitor, assess, inhibit, evoke, and shape our emotions in particular ways. Emotion work isn't just trying to display the right emotions on the outside. It means actively trying to manage the emotions that come up on the inside. For instance, by trying to transform a feeling of disappointment into gratitude, or change a sense of frustration into contentment. And within families, we know that emotion work is really gendered a lot of the time, with women and mothers as the ones who are continually working on their feelings to accommodate other family members and keep families functioning harmoniously. The moms I met engaged in emotion work to manage the guilt they experienced around food work, but the particular emotion work strategies they employed differed dramatically across the income spectrum. Lower income moms like Brenda dealt with enormous challenges and resource constraints that made feeding kids difficult. These mothers also knew that real material improvements to their financial circumstances were pretty unlikely. And that meant that it was just as unlikely that their kids' diets would ever meaningfully improve. That's not to say that low-income moms didn't try to get their kids to eat more nutritiously, but they often did so wholly cognizant of the limitations of those efforts. And so, as a rational response to such intractable structural constraints, these mothers employed the emotion work strategy of downscaling. With the deck stacked so clearly against them, low-income moms pushed down the feelings of guilt in an effort to come to terms with their current realities. That is, they did the internal emotion work to feel better about how things were, to accept their own food work and their children's diets. In downscaling, low-income moms found a survival strategy that helped them solve the emotional dilemma of guilt and also preserve a sense of dignity. In contrast, many high-income moms often took the opposite approach. These mothers engaged in upscaling, whereby they ratcheted up the already high and unattainable societal standards by which they were evaluated as mothers. And in doing so, they found their feelings of guilt escalating. Upscaling compelled mothers to do more and more on their children's behalf, with mothers' hope that doing so would eventually alleviate the guilt, although it rarely, if ever, did. Just as downscaling was a pragmatic emotional response to low-income mothers' resource constraints, upscaling was enabled by the fact that high-income mothers could generally leverage greater resources to do even more. To do these emotion work strategies of upscaling and downscaling, mothers employed a concrete set of approaches. Low-income moms zoomed out of the present moment to reflect on harder, earlier times. They deprioritized diet and prioritized other aspects of kids' well-being, and they benchmarked their food work off of other worse-off families to assuage feelings of guilt. In contrast, higher-income moms raised an already unattainable bar so that it could never fully be met. They hyper-prioritized and drilled down on diet. And like low-income families, they also compared themselves to other families, but often only to end up feeling more guilty about their food work. I'm going to briefly walk through each of these strategies to show how they work in practice, focusing on just one mother for each strategy in the interest of time. I'm going to move back and forth between the high and low income strategies to draw out the comparisons. And you can use the legend at the bottom of this screen here to help keep track of where we are. So one way that low income moms downscaled was by taking a wider lens than the current moment. They thought back to prior times when things were much harder to shine a positive light on a current situation, difficult as it may have been. When I met Lorena Garcia, a mom of two, she told me that she was feeling badly about how her family had been eating lately. A month earlier, Lorena had lost her job, and now she was hemorrhaging money and time as she searched furiously for a new position and performed side hustles to make ends meet. The result was that her kids weren't eating any of the home-cooked meals that Lorena wanted. But when I asked Lorena explicitly if she faced any challenges when it came to feeding her family, her answer caught me off guard. Lorena insisted that I don't really have any challenges at this time. What was Lorena talking about? Minutes earlier, she had detailed a number of serious issues, job insecurity and time scarcity among them. Lorena's response confused me until weeks later, I realized that Lorena had interpreted the question differently than I'd intended. She'd answered it by thinking about challenges in relative terms, comparing her current situation to previous periods in her life. When she stacked this current moment up against earlier, more difficult ones, Lorena found that she had less to feel badly about. She explained, there was a time in our lives where, before I even met my husband, that my children and I had it really bad. I had barely enough to pay the bills and not much to pay for food. Compared to back then, food today wasn't too hard for Lorena. She could downscale to shine a positive light on any of the challenges that she encountered. Sure, Lorena was spending almost half of her side gig income on food, but at least she had some income. And sure, she rarely had time to cook, but at least now she lived near a number of fast food outlets. By thinking back to times when things were really tough, Lorena could downscale her guilt into feeling better about any current shortcomings. In contrast, higher income moms often upscale to feel worse about current shortcomings. And one way they did that was by continually raising the already high societal expectations of themselves so that they kept falling short. Janae, a Black high-income mom of 3 and corporate lawyer, exemplified this upscaling approach. Janae's bar for herself was a moving target. The closer she got to it, the higher it could be raised. Janae wanted her 3 teenage daughters to eat healthy dinners, but she felt that her demanding work schedule drove her to often end up ordering takeout during the week. Janae told me, there was a point in time where we did takeout like 3 days a week. People, they all know me. Like I would just call and they would say, hi, Janae, your usual? Yeah, okay, bye-bye. And they would meet me on the road. It's embarrassing. Things came to a head for Janae when her kids told their grandmother, Janae's mom, about this routine. One time my mom asked my children, what does mommy cook for you each night? And they said, whatever's in the bag, meaning the takeout bag. And I was crushed. As a mom, talk about guilt. The guilt led Janae to ask herself an important question. Can I not figure this out? She asked herself, to be a mom, a working mom. Janae figured out a solution, and that solution was getting a new, less demanding job. When I met Janae, she'd been in her new role for 4 months, and while the hours were still long, they were more manageable, and Janae now had time to prepare weeknight dinners. But Janae's honeymoon period after the job change was short-lived. She quickly found new ways to raise the bar for herself, and in doing so, still feel guilty. Janae was now making dinners regularly during the week, but she started to feel badly that the dinners were more semi-homemade than homemade. The pre-cut vegetables and whole roasted chicken she purchased became a new source of guilt. Janae's original goal had been to make more dinners at home, but that goal soon vanished, replaced by a new one. Now, homemade meant from scratch. It meant using raw, whole ingredients, lots of prep work, and ideally at least an hour of cooking time. Unless dinner was a hot meal that Janae had planned out and over which she had labored for hours, she felt that what she was offering her daughters just wasn't good enough. Trader Joe's even has the whole thing that you toss with the sauce. I'm like, you're kidding. It's almost embarrassing because I think literally one time dinner was done in 5 minutes. Like the chicken lasagna, here's a salad. Everyone's happy, everyone's happy. And it's like we're cheating. Even though Janae had worked so hard to get to the point where she was making her kids dinner every night, even changing her professional path to do so, when she finally got there, she could only feel guilty that she wasn't doing more. What keeps you up at night is a question that I asked Lorena as we sat in her living room, a bowl of chips between us. 3 months earlier, Lorena's son Alejandro had been recruited into a gang, and now Lorena didn't know where he went most evenings. She told me, I worry that I'm going to wake up to the police knocking on my door, telling me my son's been shot. In the face of the very real possibility of losing her son, Lorena rearranged her priorities, and diet and nutrition were far from at the top of that list. Her most pressing concern wasn't whether she was getting Alejandro to eat enough broccoli. More pressing were her children's safety and emotional well-being, and these priorities took clear precedence over healthy meals. In situations like these, low-income moms like Lorena downskilled the guilt they may have felt about their kids' diets by shifting the focus away from diet and nutrition, focusing instead on other aspects of child rearing where moms felt like they were able to do a good job, like keeping their kids safe, secure, even just satiated. Jimena Morales, a soft-spoken mom of 3, really exemplified this. Living undocumented, Jimena told me, made everything more complicated. A few months before I met her, Jimena's sons had been beaten up by a local gang, forcing Jimena to look for a new home in a different neighborhood. But with a housing market offering few affordable options, Jimena had been forced to temporarily split the family up. At the time we met, Jimena and her youngest son, Juan, were living in her car. Jimena told me, it's ugly undergoing this situation, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. We eat in the street. We live in the street. Living in the street meant not having a kitchen to cook in or a fridge to store food in. Eating in the street meant that she and Juan ate out almost every evening, mostly Pizza Hut and KFC. Eating out not only helped stave off hunger, but it also offered a toilet to use and a sink to wash up in. It offered a place to sit down that wasn't Jimena's driver's seat. It offered a fleeting feeling of normalcy. It wasn't that Jimena particularly loved fast food or thought it was a healthy choice for Juan, though. To the contrary, she was deeply worried about her son's diet. She told me, in the name of Jesus, this needs to end. I need to find a place for us to live so I can make them food, because meals are very important. The most important thing is having fresh food, eating healthy. But as Jimena stared down the constellation of impossibly difficult circumstances facing her and her family, she knew that her kids' safety was simply more important than their fruit and vegetable consumption. So Jimena downscaled the guilt about what her kids were eating to highlight the ways that she was still able to do right by them. Jimena worried less about the nutritional content of their diets and more about how she could do right by them in other ways. One of those ways, she told me, was by making sure that each of her sons got to choose where to eat on different nights. She told me, they say, I want McDonald's, I want Taco Bell, I want Pollo Loco, I want Carl's Jr., I want Chinese food. I give everyone the same privilege so that they're happy. For me, all of them are equal because all of them are my children and I adore all of them very much and I want the best for them. Jimena did not feel great about the fast food, but she worked hard on her emotions to create a feeling of comfort, calm even, in the midst of a heart-wrenching situation. She downscaled the guilt she felt come up inside so as not to be reduced by the current tumult. Unlike Jimena, affluent moms did not generally have to worry to the same extent, if at all, about their kids' safety, shelter, or satiety. And taking these basic needs for granted freed up mothers' mental energy and space to focus on other aspects of their kids' well-being, like their diet. Rather than deprioritizing diet, higher income moms instead focused on how to optimize their kids' diets. They identified problems with their own approach and their children's intake, and they devised solutions to fix them. Virginia, a white stay-at-home mother, illustrated this upscaling approach. At the interview's outset, Virginia brought up the fact to me that her oldest son, Wells, was overweight. She said, from a psychology point of view, I super worry about his weight. I feel like I sort of lost that battle. I can only hope when he goes off to college, he makes good decisions. It's up to him, and he has to, and I hope he will. It's one of the greatest angst in life. Wells' weight made Virginia feel guilty, like she personally wasn't doing a good job at modeling and teaching healthy dietary habits to her children. She told me, I do not understand how I can do that, and that's how our children eat, and I have a kid who overeats, so I only pray that modeling will help. In an attempt to assuage her guilt at falling short, Virginia upscaled by doubling down on the food work. With 3 meals a day and plenty more opportunities to snack, Virginia and other higher income moms found that they could embrace all of these moments to try to fix their kids' diets. Without worries about kids' safety or security, mothers could elevate food work as a central priority. Virginia, for one, was continually vacillating between a more hands-on and a more hands-off approach to helping Wells eat better. Earlier, Virginia explained to me she tried talking to Wells about the importance of healthy eating. But when that yielded little benefit, Virginia decided she'd have to proactively regulate which food she made available to him. So that's what she was doing the day that I met her. She told me, now I pretty much just put healthy food, in front of them. Snack-wise, that's what I do. I put the grapes out half an hour ago because I know he will come home and see them and grab them. But even this approach didn't yield the intended effect, as Wells started hoarding junk food in his nightstand. With each failed attempt, Virginia continued to upscale, indulging the guilt as she sought out new opportunities to do a better job feeding her son. When I asked low-income moms about their families' diets, These moms often told me that compared to other families, they were doing okay. Benchmarking against financially worse off families, I learned, was a key downscaling strategy that helped transform mothers' feelings of guilt about shortcomings into feelings of pride. Kiara, a Black mother of 5 and school cafeteria employee, illustrated this approach. Even though I met Kiara in line at a food bank, and even though she complained about the rising cost of food, and even though she told me that her SNAP benefits ran out the 3rd week of every single month, Kiara felt that her kids' diets were much better than that of the children whose trays she filled each school day. I interviewed Kiara on Veterans Day when school was out, and Kiara told me, some babies is not going to eat today because school's not in. Like if it's vacation, what they gonna eat when they's on vacation? That's not fair for babies to come to school hungry. Compared to those families, Kiara shared, she didn't have no challenges. No, I have a lot of support. Even if I did, I have a lot of support, so I wouldn't even have those challenges. Some people don't have that, so thank God for that. I won't have any of those challenges. Kiara knew other single moms with no safety net, moms who were at the food pantry every week instead of every month. She knew moms who would have qualified for all the help she got, but they were undocumented, so they had no housing vouchers and no SNAP funds. As Kiara called those moms to the front of her mind, she downscaled her guilt to assure herself that she was doing just fine. She told me people that's living on the streets that's homeless, they have challenges, and some people can't provide for their children. But I don't have those. While observing other families helped lower income moms downscale their guilt, doing the exact same thing could have the opposite effect on their more affluent counterparts. When higher income moms looked at their neighbors, colleagues, and fellow PTA members, they found proof that they could be doing better. This was most apparent among full-time employed mothers who discussed how their jobs were often a barrier to healthy eating, as well as an ongoing source of guilt. Lori Galvez, a Latina mother who worked 50-hour weeks at a nonprofit, told me, I've always been a working mom, and I feel like the children don't get their 3 square meals like a lot of moms that don't work. Their children get a breakfast in the morning and their mom makes them lunch, and then they come home to dinner at like 5:30. While Lori recognized that her children may have eaten differently than their peers because both she and her husband worked full-time, this acknowledgement did not assuage her feelings of guilt or stop her from comparing her shopping and feeding approaches to moms with more time to devote to the task. With mothers who served as their children's full-time caregivers, Lori felt that there was a little bit more creativity going on. You know, we have the parent groups and they bring snacks, and it's always interesting what they bring. A lot of them shop at different stores. They shop at Trader Joe's. I barely go to Trader Joe's. Yet it wasn't just high-income moms who worked full-time who used social comparison to upscale the guilt. Even full-time caregiving mothers, the ones who stayed at home with their children and did have the time and the energy to devote to food, even these mothers compared themselves to others in a way that deepened their sense of guilt about what they could be doing better. Emma was one such parent. Emma dedicated a great deal of time to food work, preparing most meals for her children from scratch during the week. She explained to me, I do a lot of cooking and I try to make sure it's filling emotionally and physically. It's important to me. Yet even Emma felt she was not doing as well as she could be, and discussed repeatedly how she felt guilty about the fact that she could not get her sons to eat more vegetables. She told me, I really need to push more vegetables. I don't think I'm as good as I should be at it. Emma knew that she wasn't as good at it as she should be because she benchmarked herself against others, particularly mothers who she believed showed greater discipline with their feeding. She described one of her friends, also a stay-at-home caregiver, who embodied the maternal food work traits that Emma felt that she personally fell short of. Emma told me about this friend. She bakes, but she bakes healthy muffins and that kind of stuff, but healthier than my chocolate chip cookies. And they cook every night, every week, and really only go out for birthdays. Emma's food work would have been the envy of so many mothers, particularly full-time employed mothers. But when Emma stacked herself up against others, she found that she was upscaling her guilt and was left feeling like she was falling far short of where she should be. So I want to wrap up by sharing what I think examining and taking seriously emotions like guilt, emotion work strategies like upscaling and downscaling, and mothers' lived experiences can teach us about diet and nutritional inequality. So these are topics that to my eye are really glaringly absent from our national conversations about nutritional and dietary disparities between families. And the assumption, I think, is that emotions are tangential to or irrelevant to how each of us eat or feed. And even in conversations that we have in public discourse about how broader structural forces or inequalities drive our diets apart, we tend to forget that these inequalities don't just impact what we earn or where we live. These inequalities simultaneously exert incredible influence by shaping the very things that we think and we feel. As Arlie Hochschild once said, power doesn't work its way around feelings, it works its way through feeling. And so, as I've given you a taste today, as I've given you a taste today, and as I dive into a bit more deeply in the book, I really see feelings as actually quite central to the work of feeding. And that means that feelings are also part of the story of dietary inequities across society. Every mom that I met felt guilty about her food work. And most moms I met also engaged in emotion work to navigate those feelings of guilt, worry, and a sense of inadequacy that arose as they tried to feed their kids and live up to these unattainable cultural ideas about what it means to be a good mom in this country. But the strategies that moms used and the consequences of those strategies diverge really sharply based on their broader context and constraints. For lower income moms, downscaling could serve as an extremely effective strategy to navigate ongoing hardships and ongoing hardships that consistently challenged mothers' abilities to feed their kids the way that they wanted. At the same time, it's possible that downscaling can also work to inadvertently help cement less privileged families' diets in place through lowering mothers' expectations and beliefs in what's possible diet-wise for their children. On the other hand, more affluent mothers' upscaling help drive their continual pursuit of a better diet for their children. But by the same token, to the degree that upscaling compels more and more work for mothers, it can also aid in pulling these families' diets even further away from families with fewer resources. So my hope moving forward is that we can start to examine and integrate an understanding of how our emotions, emotion work strategies, and lived experiences, eating and feeding, impact this broader story of food and inequality in America today. So with that, I'll conclude by saying thank you so much for your time and attention and for being here today. And I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Priya. It was wonderful to hear about your work, and it's so important and timely that we're having this conversation right now. I'm just going to offer a few thoughts on your book in its entirety. And I'd like to briefly underscore two tensions throughout the book that speak to the individual and structural levels. First, throughout the book, you show us so clearly how feeding children is both joyful and excruciating for mothers. We understand through your research how care is conveyed through food, how motherhood is enacted and created through feeding children. And for women of all racial and socioeconomic backgrounds in your research, we could feel their happiness at times and their relief when preparing food or taking their children out to eat went well. Mothers seem to glow with happiness, describing making their children satisfied by food. Yet their absolute frustration and sometimes desperation with the act of feeding was also palpable, whether it be due to difficulty procuring food or difficulty meeting the unreasonable standards of mothering. And notably, these levels of frustration and joy seemed in large part independent of whether a mother had a partner living with her. And that relates to my second point, which is how your research shows women's responsibility for feeding children is really a driver of gender inequality. As we think about the maintenance of inequality, we do know that anything that women do paid or unpaid is typically unvalued, devalued. So in some ways, this is unsurprising. However, you shed light on the intricacies and the mechanisms of this inequality. I was really struck by a sentence in your conclusion. You wrote, quote, What does it say about our society that even the most privileged moms were generally riddled with stress and feelings of inadequacy about their kids' diets and their own worth as mothers? End quote. Found this to be so powerful. And when gender scholars ask why inequality is so durable, we can really point to the evidence in your book. Feeding children reproduces and supports the heteronormative family as an institution, and you show that it also reproduces gender inequality more broadly, even outside of the family. We can see that the process of preparing and feeding children takes time away from paid labor for those who can afford it. And in the physical and mental toll this responsibility takes for all mothers in your study. And stress and anxiety have negative health outcomes, of course. Reading your book, I was also reminded of Alia Rao's work, who was a postdoc at the Institute, and that even when men in heterosexual families are unemployed and ostensibly have lots of time on their hands, they typically do not then turn to contributing to the home or to domestic labor. Thus, we can see, even when the conditions change, the durability of inequality in the family is tested, but the dynamics are unaltered. Similarly, during COVID, we've seen the data about how in mostly white, dual earner, heterosexual professional couples, women spend an inordinate amount of time caring for children and doing housework, negatively impacting their careers. Your research adds some specificity and fleshes out what is exactly going on when we talk about domestic labor broadly and how it fuels inequality, and I think is relevant to both pandemic and non-pandemic times. You do end your book with a host of suggestions for remedying this unequal burden. And earlier this year, you published the Washington Post op-ed that was very promising in terms of moving in the right direction. So I'll just kick off the Q&A, Priya, by asking you, since you wrote this book, have there been any advancements, either government policy or food industry changes that are relevant to your argument?
That's a great question. And thank you so much for those really insightful comments. So yes, there have been, I would say less so on the food industry side, more so on the government policy side. And you referenced the Washington Post piece that I wrote earlier this year. And that piece was really about how during the pandemic, something that was for decades completely politically infeasible, that is universal school meals. So basically school meals that are made available to all children, regardless of household income. That once, seemingly just impossible policy change actually happened. Temporarily, universal school meals were offered during the pandemic. And in doing so, a number of children were elevated out of food insecurity, families who lost jobs or who had originally been boxed out of benefits were suddenly given access to 2 meals a day for their children. And those benefits have often been really highlighted. And in the piece, I argue that this policy change was also a gigantic win for mothers and for gender equality, because mothers spend so much time doing food work, and not just time as in minutes and hours, but also, we know about cognitive labor. And as I show in the book and in the talk a bit, like a lot of emotional labor, and the ability for an institution to take some of that burden off of mothers is a really exciting policy change. And what's happened since then is that states like California and Maine have made that permanent. There is national legislation discussing the possibility of having a federal universal school meal program. And I find something like that exciting because in the book at the end, I really talk about what can we do to shift some of the work off of mothers, and how can institutions, how can spouses, how can kind of all of these other systems in our country make something like feeding children not so much a purely private individual responsibility, but something for which we are collectively responsible and accountable. So that's one policy change that I'm excited about, alongside any kind of safety net expansion that helps make women's and mothers' lives easier, makes it easier to raise children in this country. For all of the lower income moms that I talk about in the book who were forced because of extremely challenging circumstances to have to downscale, financial relief and broader societal support is really game changing. So those are some things that I've seen happening that give me at least a small feeling of hope.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you so much. Lourdes Andrade asks, did you find that women in multi-generational households with grandparents and aunts and those with a stable partner have more support?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say yes to the former and not necessarily yes to the latter. There were families, particularly immigrant families or that were living in multi-generational households where it was often grandmothers and aunts who were helping to provide that additional support. And a lot of, I would say, particularly low-income mothers depended on family and kind of this extended network of kin to help get their kids fed. So Kiara, who I talk about, she went over to her mother's place 3 to 4 nights a week. And her mother would basically take SNAP benefits from her children and put them all together and go grocery shopping, and would help to both buffer a bit financially, but definitely like temporally to take a lot off of Kiara's plate. So that's part of why Kiara felt that she didn't have as many challenges, though even so, objectively, Kiara was really living hand to mouth, but she really focused on the things that she did have. And one of those things was having some more social support around feeding. Unfortunately, with stable partners in heterosexual couples, that often did not provide much support with the work of feeding. So it could and did supply financial support, having like a dual income household when that was the case. But oftentimes fathers didn't necessarily see it as their role to play, as their job to play a role in feeding kids. And I have some work, and I talk about it in one chapter of the book, that a lot of fathers like kind of broadly express these abstract desires for their kids to have healthy diets, but they didn't see themselves as the parent responsible for doing that. And what that meant was that when fathers were in charge of feeding kids for one evening, they felt more licensed to feed their kids unhealthy food because they believed that the rest of the time mothers were doing a good job, or mothers were in charge of it, like had a handle on it. And what that did was really raise the stakes and anxiety for mothers, because they felt like if they didn't take care of it, they couldn't depend on their spouses to put the same care and attention and devotion to their kids' diet. So there were really interesting, again, in part emotional dynamics between parents related to feeding that in some ways could even increase the burden on mothers, because they felt like fathers were so not invested, like logistically at least, in making sure their kids were fed healthy diets. So that unfortunately did not provide a ton of support. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Lori asks another question about generational differences. If someone grows up in a low-income household and sees their mothers and parents coping in the ways that you describe, do they model that even if they become high income?
Yeah, I love that question. And I actually profile a couple moms in the book who have this experience where they grew up in poverty and made their way up into the upper middle class. I talk about one mom, Letitia, who grew up very poor, got to Stanford on a scholarship, was able to do pretty well financially. And now in raising her children, she looked very similar to the other upper middle class mothers in the sample who had grown up in that class position, which speaks to kind of the power of not just changes in resources, but also, norms and expectations that are really class-based around food and feeding. For her, raising her children in the upper middle class was a lot about was really tied to how she fed them. Like, she wanted to make sure that she fed them in a way that solidified their class standing. So she talked about how when she grew up, she ate Wonder Bread with Oscar Mayer in between the slices, and how she never ever wants her children to eat that way. She wants her kids to go to the farmer's market and to, like stinky cheeses and eat avocado toast, because for her, she saw kind of the ability for them to stay upwardly mobile, to maintain their class standing as really tied to eating a certain way. And that was the case for a handful of mothers that I met who had been really socially mobile. When they made it to the higher income groups, they looked very similar in their approaches and how they thought about food to other higher income mothers. And their experiences were very much shaped by having grown up in very different circumstances and wanting something else for their children. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Priya. Another question from Erica. Was there any consideration given to a mother's skills or abilities to prepare food versus their emotions or opinions on serving healthier or home-cooked meals to their children?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that, there was obviously variation in mothers, both cooking abilities and skills, but also their enjoyment around cooking. Some mothers really liked cooking just as a practice, right? Not even about feeding children. They just enjoyed the act of cooking, versus some mothers didn't really like it, or they didn't feel like they were particularly great at it. But from my interviews, I found that, this kind of stereotype or idea that we have that there are a lot of moms, I think often it's stereotyped as low-income moms who don't know how to cook. That was not borne out in my interviews. Most moms knew how to make some dishes. They had very, I would say even above just basic cooking skills. I think felt like they had the ability to prepare foods for their children. I think what varied, though, was, whether moms enjoyed doing that work or they found it just extremely laborious or painful. And for especially higher income moms who really didn't like it, that presented a very important tension, because good moms are supposed to love feeding and nourishing their children, and they're supposed to enjoy that because it's supposed to be so natural and such like a core part of what it is to be a mother. And so for those mothers, some of the upscaling, some of the guilt was about the fact that they just didn't like doing that work, but they were expected to, and they felt like, they were perceived as not as good mothers because they didn't like doing that part of the mothering role. So I think that more so than skills or abilities was kind of the enjoyment of or desire to cook in the first place for children. Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here that are related. Elizabeth asks, what about including children in shopping and preparing food? And then Jill asks, would family cooking classes be a support for moms?
Yeah, those are great questions. So when I think about what we need to do as a society to make moms' lives easier, I often think about how we can start with children, because kids are such a driver of what families eat, and kids are always asking mothers for different foods, and often it's the foods that corporations are pushing on kids versus what mothers themselves would like kids to eat. And so there's actually a really amazing organization in San Francisco called 18 Reasons that does community cooking classes, and they go into schools and they teach kids about nutrition and food preparation, and they work with families. And what I find to be inspiring about that is that I think that to the degree that kids actually want to eat healthier food, ask their parents for healthier food, that makes moms' lives easier. As I talked about with a lot of the moms, they felt guilty that they didn't feel like their kids' diets were as healthy as they could be. And part of that, as I get into in the book, but didn't have a chance to talk about in this talk, is that kids are often asking for really unhealthy foods. And one way that moms kind of try to keep the peace is that they often accommodate their kids' tastes, or they try to cater to their kids. But if kids were asking for healthier meals, if kids wanted to cook with moms, if cooking, and preparing food was a quality activity within a family instead of just something moms are supposed to go into the kitchen and do by themselves while everyone else gets to do their homework or watch TV, then I think that actually has the opportunity to really improve the experience and remove the burden and replace it with something that's actually more joyful and meaningful. So I really like that question. I think that's a place that I think is an interesting one to start.
Wonderful. I think we have time for 2 more questions. One of them is from Maria. In your research, did you find any correlation among mothers, whether high or middle or low income, with regards to how they view the quality of their own diets? For example, she says she's known many parents who will go hungry so that their children can eat as much as desired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's something that I definitely found, just that latter point that you bring up about parents going hungry so that their kids can eat. Like, this is a really consistent research finding that within a household, parent food insecurity is often a lot higher than child food insecurity, because parents are kind of sacrificing their own satiety to make sure that kids have enough food and that they're full. So that definitely came up a lot among the low income families, and even some of like the kind of the families that were what we would consider to be like the working poor, like they're above the poverty line, but they don't qualify for a lot of benefits and they're really living hand to mouth. So I think that, sorry, let me just look at the question, the top of the question again. Yeah, so I think that a lot of lower income moms felt like their diet too was being was not as good as it could have been because of the different constraints related to finances and time and stress and all of those pressures. And that, in our conversations, they talk not just about their kids' diets, but their own diets in that way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And for our last question, Armand asks about food pantries. Having volunteered at a food pantry, I've witnessed firsthand the lack of diversity in food choices. Do you have any ideas about how food pantries can be addressed and improved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the work that food pantries do is so essential and important in this country because we have such a poor safety net. But my perspective on food banks and pantries is also that we have come in this country to believe that food banks are our solution to hunger and nutrition, and we depend on them so much. And just because of the way that food bank foods and drinks are sourced, there will always be a lack of choice for low-income families that have to go there. There will always be a situation where families, when they line up at the food bank, don't necessarily get the foods that they actually want to eat, which is kind of a whole other issue that we could go into. But one thing that I think is really interesting that's happened a lot during the pandemic relates to gleaning and taking produce that is not aesthetically pleasing, so can't be sold in the supermarket, and bringing it to food banks to actually improve the quality of food bank offerings. That has actually grown over the last 2 years and has increased the amount of produce that is available in food banks. And then the other thing that I think is often kind of controversial, especially within the food bank community, is thinking about what foods maybe food banks don't want to accept as donations. And is there a way that we can kind of shift what's on offer in food banks that creates a more nutritious and culturally appropriate set of options for families, rather than just the rest of the stuff that other people don't want, because that's a very demoralizing choice to be faced with when you come to a food bank. So those are some thoughts I have around that topic. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm so sorry we can't get to everybody's questions today, but thank you so much, Priya, for sharing your work with us. And everybody be sure to borrow her book from the library or purchase it online. And thank you all for joining us today at this Clayman Institute event. Good night.
Thank you so much.